Welcome, everybody, and thank you for joining us at tonight's History at Home. Um, Looking forward to it because, as I said to Lisanne, I really don't know a lot of the information about this gentleman, so I really enjoy being able to learn something new. So, thank you, Lisanne, for agreeing to do this tonight. Um, those of you who were part of our program 2 weeks ago on the League of Women Voters, I thought it was so much fun to hear those women tell their stories, what remarkable stories they had. It is not yet up on YouTube. It will be up on YouTube soon, but I just have not been able to get to it yet. So keep your eyes open for that if you missed it, because I think you'll really enjoy it. I want to thank you for your support. New York Times had an article today about how museums are having such a hard time surviving, especially small ones. And I think the History at Home folks have helped me because you've helped us connect, which has been tremendous. But it also, you've helped with your financial support as well. And, a lot of places are suffering. And so we really, truly, truly appreciate that. And you can do it if you'd like by going on our website. After you vote, go back to the homepage and then enter the site. And from there, you can get online and you can donate online or become a member online. You can also do it by Venmo. Just look at Montclair History Center on Venmo if you are on Venmo. And then finally, you could send us a check if you have extra funds. We would love to have some support that way as well. And I believe that's it. So I am going to now turn it over to Lisanne, and you may share your screen now. And we will go ahead with tonight's program, which is Francis A. Nelson, Making a Mark on Montclair.
Okay. Well, I'm excited to be here today to talk about Francis Nelson because not only have I become a little obsessed with him as I keep discovering more Francis Nelson buildings around Montclair, but also during tonight's presentation, I think we have joining us some of Francis Nelson's descendants and also some descendants of people who commissioned Francis Nelson to build a house. So that's kind of a great situation to be in. What I'm going to do tonight is focus primarily on Francis Nelson's Montclair contributions because he did build many houses along the eastern seaboard, particularly in New York and Connecticut and New Jersey, but I'm going to focus on Montclair. So this is just to give you an overview of his legacy in Montclair. He designed over 30 Montclair buildings. 6 of them are on state or national registers of historic places, and another 8 are in national historic districts within Montclair. And his designs reflect numerous historic styles. He really was devoted to period styles and executed them very meticulously. And he worked in various spheres from civic to religious, commercial, and domestic, particularly stately homes. He also served on Montclair's zoning board of adjustment for 16 years, and he sat on the planning board, on some planning board committees. So he helped shape Montclair both through his design and through his community service. He was born in Hawaii when it was still a kingdom. And his father was a US Navy fleet surgeon in the Pacific, which is why that was. He only lived there for about a month. And then he spent most of his boyhood in New London, Connecticut, the Washington Navy Yard, Carlsbad, Germany, Vienna, Austria, and Westminster, Maryland. And he attended boarding school at St. Paul's in Concord, New Hampshire. And ultimately, in 1950, he died in Montclair. His architectural education started with Columbia University, where he graduated from the School of Architecture in 1900. And then he went to Paris to study at the École des Beaux-Arts. And while he was in Europe, he also received a McKim Fellowship to travel and study around Europe. And that began in 1903. And while he was in Europe, he got a lot of firsthand exposure to historic styles as he went around France, England, Belgium, Italy, and Spain. And he studied architecture and he sketched it. And this exposure to these styles around Europe would ultimately be reflected in his own work in Montclair. The reason there's a plate on this slide, it's a plate that he was involved in creating, and I wanted to emphasize his strong connection to Columbia University. This is a set of, one of a set of a dozen commemorative plates for Columbia University that were done for the Alumni Association in 1932. And Francis Nelson was the one who designed these plates. Each one featured a different building in Columbia's evolution, and they were fundraisers for the Alumni Association. I'll give you a little overview of his early career. Right out of college, he started working at McKim, Mead and White, where he was for a year. And when he came back from his European schooling and study, he established the firm of Nelson and Van Wagenen in 1906 with a fellow Columbia grad. And while he was also practicing architecture, he was teaching it as well at Columbia. Some of the earliest buildings that Nelson and Van Wagenen did as partners were primarily churches and homes in New York City and in New York State. And there's just one example at the left here, which is the Bethany Memorial Church in New York City, which they built in 1908. And this is the, as far as I know, the only building of Nelson's that was ever demolished. This one was demolished in 2002. And now Van Wagenen had a sudden heart attack in 1915. And so after that point, Nelson's established a solo career. Among his portfolio of buildings were civic buildings, which included libraries, the Upper Montclair Post Office, the Masonic Temple, and the Women's Club of Upper Montclair. Now, the Bellevue Avenue Branch Library was his very first commission in Montclair, and this went up in 1914. It was a Carnegie Library, and it's now on both the national and state registers of historic places. It's a neo-colonial temple design, and it's very rich in this kind of neoclassical detail. On the left, you see some measured drawings, which show elements of the architecture of this building. And on the right, if you look closely in the frieze there, you'll see in the limestone an open book, which is so perfect for a library. Nelson also designed the Verona Public Library a few years later than the Montclair Library. And this was part of the municipal complex that's in Verona on the, I believe it's the north side of Bloomfield Avenue. There's a whole municipal complex done in this same style. And this building is also a Carnegie Library, and it was extensively renovated just a few years ago. Now, this is Montclair's main library from 1904 to 1955 at the corner of Valley Road and Church Street. It was not designed by Francis Nelson, I want to make that clear. However, he was commissioned to come up with a plan in 1930 to replace this building with a bigger library because the old library had become too crowded. So he worked with one other architect, Henry C. Pelton, who had been the architect for Riverside Church in New York City. And they came up with this plan, which would have been, as I said, right in the same spot at the corner of Valley and Church Street. Now, this never was built, obviously. This was because the planning board was resistant to having it built, number one, because they were still in the process of creating a master plan, and they didn't want to approve something this significant while the master plan was still being written. And it was also during the Depression, when a costly project like this did not have a lot of community support. But the reason that Francis Nelson was selected to be the architect for such a prominent project is for twofold. Number one, it was he had over a quarter century of architectural design experience. And number two, the Montclair Times cited his, quote, friendly and informal dignity, which gives you a little sense of what his personality might have been like. Then the Upper Montclair Post Office was another early building of his on the civic sphere. We're all familiar with this one. It was built in 1918 by the Anderson Realty Company, which was led by Robert Anderson, who was the son of the founder of Anderson Park. This is on the National Register of Historic Places. And when it was built, the Montclair Times described its style as early English style of rural architecture. I mean, it's basically a Tudor cottage. It has the half timber elements and the stucco, little small paned windows, and a kind of what I would call a steep cat slide slate roof. But one of the more unusual elements about this building is if you look at the right-hand side, there's a stairway, which is kind of oddly sort of stuck onto the side of the building, rather exposed. And there's a reason for that. That's because originally the plan was to build a much larger project. And when phase two of this project would have been built, that stairway that you see would have been enclosed. And of course, we know that stage two never happened. Or the original idea was that it would, quote, be completed from time to time as building conditions warrant it. So apparently that never occurred, and we still have that sort of unusual looking stairway. He also built the Masonic Temple. He was a member of the newly formed Upper Montclair Lodge 214. And he, in designing this building, was very conscious of the fact that it was going to be a very prominent building at the northern gateway of Montclair. So it needed to be a special building for that. It also needed to have a high ceiling because the lodge had an organ loft that took up a half floor of the top level, and they wanted a high peaked ceiling with heavy beams for what they called an ecclesiastical effect for their meetings. The original building had shops at the street level, offices and a banquet hall on the second floor, and then Masonic uses with the big hall with the high peak ceiling and the organ on the third floor. And of course, if you've lived in town for a long time, you know that this was the ground floor was the Olympic shops for a while, and it's now Williams and Sonoma. In 1923, when the Montclair Times ran this photograph or this sketch in announcing that this building was going to be constructed, the article explained that the design was supposed to be quote, an exact replica of the south transept of Wells Cathedral in Somerset, England. This is really puzzling to me because the Wells Cathedral is a Gothic building that looks absolutely nothing like the Masonic Temple that you see here. However, there's one other cathedral in England, Westminster Cathedral, not to be confused with Westminster Abbey, which does look a little bit like this building, especially if you look at it from the second floor and above, which is what was described in the newspaper article. Some of those elements look a little bit like the building that we have in Montclair, but it's a little bit of a stretch. Then Nelson also designed the Women's Club of Upper Montclair. His wife, Helen, was a member of the club, and so he offered to donate the plans for the building and donate supervising the construction of the building. This building just this year won a preservation award from Montclair's Historic Preservation Commission. One of the elements of it that was considered highly needed in Upper Montclair was a large auditorium, and it does have that inside. And this building too is on the National Register of Historic Places. One of the things that I find interesting about this building is on the exterior, it's colonial revival in style, and on the interior, it's Tudor revival. And when you're inside, it's really lovely, and you feel like you could be at a banquet with Henry VIII or something like that. Francis Nelson also designed memorials and religious buildings. He was the architect behind the St. James Church Memorial Bell Tower. And he also was involved in designing a World War I memorial at what is now Buzz Aldrin School, back then was Mount Hebron School. And he designed at least 6 churches on the Eastern Seaboard in their entirety. So this is what St. James Church looked like before it was even St. James. At that point, it was the Cliffside Chapel, which was built in 1878. And you'll see it has a pointed steeple, looks very different than how we know it today. So this is the tower that Francis Nelson designed in 1919 after World War I. And it was designed to be both a memorial to 7 congregants who died in World War I, but also an expression of gratitude to the 93 congregants who returned safely. Just for a point of reference, Montclair, the entire town, lost 71 residents to World War I. Now, this tower as a memorial was really built at lightning speed. I mean, it went up in 13 months from the time the armistice was called until the time this tower was dedicated. And the tower holds 11 bronze bells, 7 of which are inscribed with the names of servicemen killed in the war. And the iconography of this tower is a really interesting and unusual mix of church and state. So the circles that you see here, the red circle is where the US coat of arms is. And then where the yellow circles are the buttresses where there are shields. And I'll show you close-ups of those in a minute. Above the red circle, so above the coat of arms, or the seal, I should say, the US seal, is also an inscription. The inscription says, "The right shall prevail." And the origin of this inscription is a little bit mysterious. It could be religious, secular, or literary. It may come from a post-armistice speech by Woodrow Wilson, or it may come from a psalm, or it may come from an 1863 Longfellow poem titled, "I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day." And this was a poem that he wrote about despair over the Civil War. This is a close-up of some of those iconography features I was mentioning earlier. So on the left is the US coat of arms, which was where the red circle was, right in the center of the tower. And then on the right is one of 8 shields that are around the exterior of the tower. Each side of the tower has 2 of these shields, and each one is different. 5 of them symbolize nations. So one symbolizes USA, one is Italy, England, Belgium, and France. Another one symbolizes victory, and 2 of them represent military divisions that included New Jersey troops. Now, the tower was rededicated and also restored in 2017. And when that happened, the church took on the project of researching and profiling the 7 parishioners who were killed in World War I. And their photographs and their stories were set up along the walkway leading to the tower for the rededication ceremony. Now, Nelson was a member of St. James Church. He was an Episcopalian, and he not only did the tower, but he did a number of other projects for them. And this is one of those projects. It's the Reredos, or Reredos, I think is how you pronounce it, which is behind the altar. On the left, you see this Gothic tracery, Reredos, before it was installed. And this was installed in probably the mid 1940s. And he had Hildreth Mier, who is a painter, do the painting that you see here in the center of Christ with the two fishermen, who were St. James the Apostle and his brother, St. John the Evangelist. Now, Francis Nelson's grandson, who's Frank Nelson III, tells a family story that the architect had his large scale drawings of this Reredos spread out on the living room floor, and little Frank was found riding his tricycle either around them or over them. So it's a little detail I like. This is another memorial, the one I mentioned, that's now at Buzz Aldrin School. And this was also to 7 students from the Mount Hebron School who died during World War I. And this was erected in 1922. It's a door and entranceway with plaque above the door. It's for the auditorium of the school, and it says Valor at the top. And although Nelson did the design for this, the carving of this wooden, this is oak, the carving of this oak was carried out by a sculptor named Joseph Renier. Now, I think a lot of people are most familiar perhaps with Nelson through his domestic architecture. He designed more than 20 homes in Montclair, and he also designed many more beyond that in New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut in particular. But in Montclair, there are at least 20 of them, and their styles include everything from Georgian to colonial, Tudor, and Mediterranean. But the one thing they all have in common is they're rooted in a historic period style. Now, 2 of these homes are on the National Register of Historic Places, and 8 more are within National Historic Districts in Montclair. This is Nelson's own home, which is at 303 Highland Avenue, and he moved into it in December 1915. On the left is a Christmas card that he sketched of his home that when he would have been sending out exactly 100 years ago. It's from 1920. And on the right is a picture of his home that was used in a Cabot's paint commercial, or not commercial, but magazine ad. Now this home, he actually lived in Montclair for a few years before he built this house. And he was an architect working out of New York City, but eventually he did shift his practice to Montclair, and I believe he worked in an office out of his attic. This home is within the National Mountain Historic District. One of the unusual features of this house is that it faces Highland Avenue sideways rather than with a front facade facing the street. It's made out of cypress, it's clad in hand-hewn cypress shingles. And it's in the colonial revival style, which he seemed to really like this style a lot. And he did at least 4 other homes in this sort of clapboard or shingle colonial revival style in Upper Montclair, which I'll show you. And he also, I think, gained an appreciation for this style while he was living in New England, would be my guess. And in Saybrook, Connecticut, he actually reconstructed 2 early American homes and had some other work with the New England colonial styles in Connecticut. This was the next door neighbor to his house, which was built not just next door, but only 1 year later. And this is 301 Highland, was commissioned by Robert Litchfield, who was a telephone company engineer. This home, 190 Cooper Avenue from 1919, is another early example of his colonial revival style. It was featured in Country Life magazine, and it was also featured in a magazine ad for a shingle stain company. It's an individual landmark on the National Register of Historic Places, and it was built for Arthur Marcellus, who was president of Osborne and Marcellus, which was a prominent coal, lumber, and construction material company in Upper Montclair. This is another of his colonial revival homes. And this home on Highland was built sometime between 1923 and 26. And it was featured in an magazine put out by Bamberger's department store called Charm. It was one of 3 homes featured in a 1930 article in Charm that was written by Nelson about 3 specific houses in Upper Montclair. One of the things that this house has, 140 Highland, is a sun porch. And a sun porch is something that you see a lot of in Nelson's houses. Many of them have them. And just going back for a second, you'll see that this house has one on both sides. And in the article that Nelson wrote in Charm, he talked about how he did this because he wanted balance. He felt that having one on each side balanced out the house. Now, this house at 117 Bellevue Avenue was not originally designed by Nelson. It started out as something different in 1890. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find a photograph of what it originally looked like, but it was inherited from somebody by his sister. And the new owners, who were Dr. Irving Meeker and his wife, Elizabeth is the one who inherited the house from her brother, they wanted to update it with a colonial revival look. And so they hired Nelson to do this. And if you look above the doorway, it has this broken pediment, which you'll see in a lot of his houses as we go along. It's a very common Nelson feature. Now, this is the Anchorage. We're going to sort of switch now from the colonial revival houses to the Georgian houses, because Nelson did quite a number of Georgian houses in Montclair, and this is by far his most celebrated one. It's on the National Register of Historic Places. It's appeared in architectural exhibitions at the Newark Museum and at the Montclair Art Museum, and it also received a commendation from the American Institute of Architects. It was built by Edith Duff Gray Hubbard after her husband died. They were a wealthy couple, and they already had a Montclair home on a double lot at the corner of Park Street and Wildwood. And their double lot had a rose garden, and they had a deal that when one of them died, the other one would build, quote, a little house in the rose garden. So this is that little house. And their previous house is right next door, but it faces Park Street instead of Wildwood. Lewis, the husband, was a lawyer, a banker, and a manufacturer of tools, dies, and measuring instruments. He was the one who died first. And Edith, who was a powerhouse in the Women's Club organization, took up this construction project with gusto. She traveled all over gathering ideas for her dream house. Ultimately, this house was inspired by Westover, which was a tidewater plantation built along the St. James River in Virginia around 1750 by William Byrd. And Byrd was the man who founded the Virginia city of Richmond. The Anchorage, in fact, is made of James River bricks, and its original landscape was by a notable landscape architect, Ralph Hancock, who a few years after doing the landscape for this house would go on to design the 11th floor Gardens of Nations for Rockefeller Center. Now, the Anchorage has a very dramatic front door with a broken pediment, as you've seen on that house on Bellevue Avenue. And Nelson has, a lot of his houses have very dramatic doorways. And no two of them are exactly the same. These are 2 more examples of his doorways. He also has, in many of his houses, really dramatic sweeping staircases. This one is from the Anchorage. This one is from a 1919 house at 330 Upper Mountain Avenue, which is right where Bellevue Avenue dead ends at the west end. Now, right across the street from the Anchorage is another Nelson house at 168 Wildwood Avenue, built 1 year before the Anchorage. And this house was built by Arthur B. Woollum, who was a vice president and treasurer of the American Sugar Refining Company, where he started working as an office boy at age 14. This is what that house looks like now, very similar to the rendering that you just saw. And here we have a floor plan on the left-hand side, and on the very far left of the floor plan, you can see the study. And on the right-hand side, you can see Mr. Woollum in that study. Now, you know, a lot of times when a homeowner commissions an architect to design a house, they will sort of hand down the plans and the renderings and the blueprints to the next owner. And that, for whatever reason, didn't happen with this house originally. But there's a really great story. In August 2004, about 75 years after this home was constructed, two strangers knocked on the door bearing documents. They were the great niece and great nephew of Mr. Woollum, and they had been very young when he died in 1958. But they had inherited the plans, the renderings, the blueprints for this house, which had been separated from this house for nearly a half a century. And they very generously gave them to the new owners, who now have them framed and hanging in their dining room. This is one of the documents that they gave to the owner. This is a plot plan, shows where the house was in relation to some rather elaborate gardens. And one little detail about this garden that I really like, on the left-hand side, you see something called a drying yard. Now, a drying yard was where you hung up your laundry to dry because you didn't have an electric or a gas-powered clothes dryer. And it would have been surrounded by a high hedge so that your neighbors don't see your underwear flapping in the wind. And you can have a little garden party in your backyard without people seeing your laundry drying. So I like that little detail. Now, across town in the estate section, and about 8 years later, this house went up, which is really sort of, I like to think of it as the big sister to the Woollum house that you just saw, because the design is very similar, but it's just a lot bigger. And this house was built for William and Ruth Vogel. He was a chairman of Standard Container Company. And these owners are also lucky because they have one of the original sketches of the facade of their house that has been handed down to them over the years. Now, another Georgian house, this one facing Edgemont Park, was also one of the three homes that was featured in the Charm magazine article. The photo you see on the left is from the Charm magazine article, and the one on the right is how it looks today. Very, very similar, hardly any change at all, which is nice. Now, this house on 315 Upper Mountain was described in the Montclair Times in the year it was built, 1939, as being, quote, the largest and most expensive dwelling of the year. And it was built by Robert Lucars, who was president of the Industrial Press, which published engineering magazines and books. And this house is in the National Mountain Historic District. Another of the Georgian homes, and this one has a fascinating story. We have to now shift gears a little bit, and we're going to travel to Newark, where this house is. This was a model home that was built by the Bamberger department store. It was the concept of Louis Bamberger, who was the owner of that store, and it was intended to be a showcase for the store's furniture and electrical appliances. And it contained many novel features, such as water heaters for bathrooms, burglar alarms, an inter-house telephone, a clothes dryer, an electric stove, an electric washing machine, outlets in the baseboards. I mean, Architecture magazine in 1924 described this as each detail of its construction is as perfect as modern science and invention can make it. The home was a cooperative effort of more than 100 manufacturers, designers, contractors, and decorators. And at its groundbreaking in 1923, dignitaries attended. And during the 1 year that it was open as a model home, over 200,000 people toured the completed home. And then Bamberger sold it in 1924. This is the ideal home today. It looks very similar, except it's lost its shutters. And it is faces Weequahic Park, and it's now within the Weequahic Park Historic District. So we've seen examples of Nelson's colonial revival homes and his Georgian style homes. Now we're going to shift over and look at some of his Tudor homes. This is the one you've already seen the stairway to. It's where Bellevue Avenue has its western terminus at Upper Mountain. And this house was built by the same person who built the post office, which you've seen earlier, and the Bellevue movie theater. It was built by Robert Anderson, who was the son of Charles Anderson, again, who donated the land for Anderson Park. This house is in the Mountain Historic District. And if you've always wanted a Nelson home, this is your opportunity because it is for sale right now. And this is the backyard of that home. Around 1925, the Anderson family is gathered here. The owner of the home is the builder is the man back row, far left, holding a cane. That's Robert Anderson and his immediate family with him. And then below are other family members. And the man holding the toddler is Charles Anderson, who donated the land for Anderson Park. Now, on a much more modest, smaller scale is another Tudor home that was built in 1921 in the Tudor style for a piano teacher. In this house, if you see the picture, the sketch on the left by Nelson, the house is a little bigger than what you see on the right. I'm not sure if that's because they chose to build a slightly smaller house or if there were originally sort of an option for expansion, if that were to ever be desired. But this was a house that had intentionally high ceilings that would be good for acoustics because there were piano lessons held here. You can see 3 pianos in this picture, and recitals were also held by Miss Tracy, as she was known in this house. So this was not only her piano studio, but she also lived in this house. It was her home as well. And this is Miss Tracy on the right. And one of the really nice little details of this house on the exterior is the treble clef on the chimney. And the current owner, when she had her chimney repointed, went through the trouble and a lot of effort to have this treble clef restored and reinstalled. Now, this Tudor home, which is on Upper Mountain Avenue, was built in 1927, and the National Register nomination report for the Mountain District calls it, quote, one of the most outstanding of the Tudor homes in this district. It was built for John Knowles Fitch, who was a leader of Columbia University's Alumni Association, which, if you remember, was the same group that commissioned those Wedgwood plates from Nelson in 1932. Fitch also founded the Fitch Publishing Company, which developed a financial securities rating system, which is still used today. Then up the street, a little north, is 316 Highland Avenue, built in 1927, excuse me. This is the third house to be featured in Charm magazine. And this house is an utter charm. It's also a beautiful Tudor jewel box. It was built by H.J. and Helen Brott. H.J. Brott founded a milk products brokerage firm. Now this house it's Tudor style like the one we just saw, but it's much more compact than the other one, but it has so much exquisite Tudor detail packed into it. Just for one example is this stained glass rondelle on the right. It's on the page of the book is inscribed the name, the signature of the artist who did the rondelle, a man named Frederick J. Kurz. It's too small to see in this picture, but he did that and a number of other stained glass rondelles that are in this house. Now, the house has some really interesting features like this overmantel, which is above the fireplace. It's a 15th century carved oak overmantel in the living room, which was imported from a Tudor manor house in Cheshire, England, where it had originally been. And then building on that are um, carvings throughout the house that were modern. They were done specifically for this house in New York City. This piece being one example. It's a wall panel with griffins flanking a knight. There are other figures like this in both carved wood and plaster in the dining room and the living room, with figures like dragons, crowns, human faces, Tudor roses, um, really very rich decoration, right down to the radiator covers. I mean, the radiator covers are this beautifully carved wood. Then what also makes this house so special is that it comes with practically a mini archive along with it, because the original owner saved every scrap of paper related to the house's creation, construction documents, shipping documents. For example, when that overmantel for the fireplace came over from England from the manor house in Cheshire, there's letters back and forth about that. There are blueprints, sketches, photos of the house under construction. So they really allow you to see how this building went from concept to creation. And just one little example of that is here. There's a sketch that was on a piece of stationery of the owner. So we don't know who did the sketch. We don't know if it was the owner's sketch or if it was a sketch by Nelson. But then you see that sketch realized in this corner of the limestone fireplace. And similarly, we have one example of a blueprint that shows the carved wooden doors that lead from the living room to the dining room. Now, this house is currently being considered or being researched by the Montclair Historic Preservation Commission, because the owner of the house is interested in self-nominating this house to be an individual local landmark in Montclair. So that should be really interesting when that comes to fruition. And a next door neighbor to the house we just saw is this one, also at 310 Highland. It was built just 2 years later than the one we just saw. And it also has a lot of rich Tudor detail, carved wood, leaded glass windows, and handcrafted metalwork. The owner, or the original owner, was Lucille and Charles W. Hamilton. Hamilton worked for an oil company and he spent time in the Middle East. And his initials, CWH, are placed right above the front door lintel. So you knew whose house you were walking into when you entered. Now, further north along Highland Avenue is this house, which was built in 1937 for Robert Hooke, who was an engineer. And at the time, it was given a local Montclair award for best designed house under $20,000. This was in 1937. It sold last month for $1.2 million. Now, down on the other end of town, on Porter Place at the corner of, I believe it's maybe Harrison and Porter, is this Tudor house, which is really a fairy tale cottage. And this photo doesn't do it justice because it has a lot of elements in the back that are kind of secluded and tucked away that you can't see from the street, like a little round tower and secluded gardens. It was built for William and Salome Bell in 1926. He was a CPA. And it had particular attention paid to the grounds, which were designed by Marjorie Sewell Cautley. She was the first female landscape architect to design state parks, to plan grounds for a federal funded housing project, and to lecture in a university city planning department. Now, I don't think that her grounds are still intact. I know in 2018, the house and the grounds were extensively remodeled. So I don't know what might be left of the original design of the gardens. Also on this end of town on Union Street in the National First Residential Historic District is, this is not a Tudor home, of course, this is colonial style, but it was one of the later homes to be designed by Francis Nelson. It's much more restrained than some of his other ones. It's very pure with its symmetry on the exterior, with one exception. If you look on the right-hand side, there's like a one-story little annex. And this is because the person who built the house, Dr. John A. Atkinson, was a medical doctor, and he built this was where his offices were, and he saw patients in this little annex that you see here. And the owners of this house are lucky to have had handed down to them over the decades this blueprint that shows the front elevation of the house. Now this house, which you probably would recognize, 159 Upper Mountain, was another early house that Nelson designed. And it's unusual for Nelson because, as far as I know, it's the only Mediterranean style home that he did, certainly the only one he did in Montclair. And it reflects his grounding in historical period styles and the influence of his studies and his travels. For example, it's similar in style to this house by A.J. Downing of an Italian villa from A.J. Downing's book of Country Homes. And this would have been something that Nelson probably would have studied as an architecture student, and he probably would have encountered Italian villas on his European tour, and would have possibly drawn from that while designing essentially what is a Montclair villa. This house at 88 Upper Mountain was built in 1946, and it's probably Nelson's final house to be built. And it's also in a style by him that we don't see much at all in Montclair by him, the French Revival style. It's based on country houses of landed gentry in places like Brittany and Normandy. And this house was built for a cattleman named Swen Swenson. And it's also in the National Mountain Historic District. Now, the day that Nelson died unexpectedly in 1950, that very day, some of his latest designs for a new development in Yanticah were on display at a local bank. And we're unsure if any of those were actually carried out. Possibly not, because he wouldn't have been around to execute them. But we're not sure whatever, if anything, materialized from those houses for Yanticah. But over the 30 or 40 decades that Francis Nelson lived and worked in Montclair, he left an impressive portfolio of buildings that now enrich our town. And the next time you hear the St. James bells peal, or you're sipping coffee outside Java Love in Upper Montclair, or you're just admiring the facade of the Bellevue Branch Library, now you can reflect for a moment on the man who's behind all that. So I'd also like to thank these people who helped me put this together, most particularly Helen Nelson Skeen, who is the granddaughter of Francis Nelson, and provided me with an abundance of material, and is an amazing researcher. And many other people have also helped providing research or letting me into their homes or sharing blueprints and renderings and so forth with me. So thank you to that, all of you, for doing that. And I also just want to do a shout out for Friends of Anderson Park. I became acquainted with Nelson for the first time because of his connection with the Anderson family. As I mentioned, he did build 2 buildings for the Anderson family. So there's a strong link there. And if anybody out there has any more knowledge of other Nelson homes and you want to let me know about them, here's my email. Definitely contact me. Thank you.
Great.
Oh, thank you.
The Aunt Florence was my great aunt, and I live in one of his homes at 190 Cooper. So I
Oh,
love it. Thank you.
oh, that's great. Thank you. And I think you're the person, Lenny, who provided me with the photos of Miss Tracy. So I really appreciate that.
You had a couple of people online in the chat room who mentioned that they'd actually taken classes with Miss Tracy.
Oh,
So
I
that's
did
great.
too. Terrible student. She
Yeah,
served
she
Melody
taught.
cookies, and I have all brothers, but she favored girls. So I have many of her pieces in my house, antiques that we had to pull out. And the people that are living there really appreciate her home. I had no idea he designed my aunt's house. And I have two other friends that own his houses. So who knew?
Oh, that's
Thank
great.
you. This was fascinating.
You should start a Nelson club.
I get you.
So you've got a few questions in the chat room, Lisanne, and I'm gonna just run through. But people are welcome to jump in with their own questions as well. The first was about the Van Wagenen name, and they wondered if there was any relation to the Mets' former GM or whether it could have been somebody out of Jersey City. Any
You
knowledge?
know, I don't know the answer to that. If I had had more time, I would have probably pursued Van Wagenen a little more, because at one point I stumbled on an article in the Montclair Times that made it look like Van Wagenen lived in Montclair. And I just wasn't able to really pursue that because I ran out of time. So I don't know is the short answer.
Okay. And then someone else asked whether or not perhaps he always oriented the house so that the sunroom caught the sun.
Oh, that's that's a logical idea. I don't know. That's something that makes
Did
sense.
he orient the houses so the sunrooms got the sun?
That
No.
makes plenty of sense.
Well, we're on the north and east side, and it gets almost no sun.
Are the privately held blueprints and plans digitized and or preserved by the Montclair Historic Preservation Commission or the public library?
Every person I've talked to, for the most part, I beg them to do that. For my knowledge, nobody has done that yet. It is a little bit costly, but I actually have been putting together a list of places where people could send their blueprints to have them scanned. And some people have not just blueprints, but very fragile sketches. And the person that owns the home that has a treasure trove of documents at 316 Highland, some of those documents are in really good condition, but some of them, they're now 100 years old and they're on highly acidic paper and they're getting a little crumbly. But whenever I get the chance, I ask people to please, please, please scan these. I know that the documents for the Woolham house, which is the 168 Wildwood, those have been scanned. And I think that it was the descendant of Woolham scanned them and has kept them for the scans for himself and gave the originals to the owner. And so there is scans of those, but most of these, no, they have not yet been scanned. And I really would love to see that happen. And then I would love to see them kept in multiple places, like the Montclair History Center, the Montclair local libraries, local history room. And you can also then do so much more with them too. You can enlarge them, frame them in various sizes, blow them up, look at them carefully. So there's a lot of advantages to having those digitized.
Jane, may I just make a suggestion?
Yes, please do.
When I was on the New Jersey Historical Commission, that was the kind of grant that we would often give. I was on Grants and Prizes, the committee. So, one thing you might consider is either through the History Center or through your local Historical Preservation Commission. It's just a great grant proposal. I know when I was on my West Orange Historical Commission, we had some money to encumber and we encumbered it and then had done, scanning and digitizing of certain records. So I
And they
really
will-
hope it
They
happens.
do. They
That'd be great.
actually gave us a grant a couple of years ago to digitize our entire collection of Montclair directories that date back to the 1890s. So yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing they look for. Quickly, couple more little comments in the chat room here. Did Nelson have contemporaries as prolific as he was in Montclair?
I'm sorry, did he have contemporary?
Who were as prolific as he?
Oh, sure. There was Norris, A.F. Norris, I think, was very prolific and of the same type of projects. And there are several other people who are escaping me now because.
Dudley Van Antwerp?
Yes, thank you very much. And there were others. I think one of the things that's Leslie Walker, or I think it's Walker, Leslie somebody. There were several other people too who I think were prolific and working at sort of that high level of architectural detail. I think one of the things that I find interesting about Nelson is that he crossed a lot of boundaries. He did not only homes, but he did religious buildings and he did civic buildings. So he kind of covered all bases.
The other thing I found interesting, Lisanne, was that when Deborah David did her program on the houses that were in Scientific American, there were a lot of most of the houses had changed over the years. And I found it remarkable that so many of the Nelson houses looked the way he designed them still.
That's true. It's actually very heartening because sometimes in these situations, it breaks your heart when you see what's happened to a house. And most of these houses, in fact, I would say all of them are loved and cherished. The only change that I tend to see happen in 1, 2, maybe 3 of the houses is that the shutters go by the wayside for whatever reason. But they're all in very good shape, at least from what I can see on the outside. And the ones I've been to on the inside are lovely on the inside. On the inside, some of them have changed in terms of, I mean, they've vastly been modernized on the inside, but on the outside, that's not the case. In one, I think it's at 237 Upper Mountain Avenue, that big Tudor house owned by Fitch. That house has a garage, and that garage was subdivided and is now a standalone house. That's how amazing the garage was. But it still looks intact as its original architectural style.
Before we close, I just want to share one tip. Sharon says that the Anchorage has now had the white holiday lights put up, and it looks absolutely spectacular. So
good.
Driving around and looking for something to do, you can drive past the Anchorage.
All right.
Lisanne, I have a question about the Hildreth Meyer at St. James.
Okay.
Did Nelson engage her to do that, or do you know if the church
on her
engaged?
website, the website for her,
Yeah.
It says that he commissioned her.
Great.
Yeah.
I don't know if people know much about Hildreth Meyer. She is a spectacular mosaic artist, and she did several significant buildings in New York: St. Bart's Cathedral, St. Bart's Church, Temple Emmanuel, on Wall Street, and the medallions on the south side of Radio City. And she's an Art Deco phenomena.
Thank you. Any other closing comments before we sign off?
I'm sorry. Before you sign off, we have Mrs. Skeen. Do you see her face? Henny, the name Henny.
Yeah.
Yeah, she's the person who worked with me on this. So she's the granddaughter of Francis Nelson. So you wanted to mention something, Henny?
I was going to go back to Van Wagenen, my grandfather's partner. He died young, and I don't believe he had any children, but he seemed to come from a family that had went way back in New York. So there could have been other relatives in the family, but I don't believe he had any children. And his wife went on and married 2 more times, but she was the godmother to my father and my aunt. So they were very close friends.
Thank you.
I want to say thank you. Thank you.
Anyone else? Any other family members you'd like to acknowledge, Lisanne, before we sign off?
Well, aside from Henny, I'm not sure who else is on. Is there anybody else?
Frank is on.
Oh, Frank? Frank was the one who was riding his tricycle around the Reredos drawings.
his daughter's on, and my son was on, and a cousin in Washington State was on.
That's great.
Thank you for coming on. Appreciate it. Thank you, Lisanne. Everybody have a safe and
And I-
happy Thanksgiving, and we'll see you in 2 weeks.
All right.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, Lisanne.